Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for another making video, this being the third component of the Carving a Bone Fishhook series. Now, it's also the fourth straight up bone carving video on the channel, and each of these videos have built skill. So the first is very, very simple, carving an eyed needle from bone. Okay? And then we carve a practical style fishhook from natural bone forms, which, although I made it gigantic so it would be easy to see on film using a cow bone, these made out of deer bones or pig bones or sheep, goat bones or smaller animal bones very much are a dominant component of bone fishing equipment worldwide, archaeologically, right? So very broad arc there. Then we did a two-piece bone fishhook, and now we're doing a one-piece ornate bone fishhook. The latter two definitely having some Polynesian influences. I did half of my grad school out at the University of Hawaii, so that's where that comes from. The purpose of this particular fishhook I want to explain before I show it to you. It's not a practical, I'm going to go fishing with this fishhook. When my wife and I were on our honeymoon, one of the things that we did was charter a fishing trip for landlocked salmon and trout at Lake Winnipesaukee up in New England. Okay. Now, I want to carve a representation of the fish that we caught. We've been married for 10 years, and I want to just make a little memento of that trip. Okay. And I want the three keepers that we caught and ate. Yes, catch, clean, cook is the Old Ways Rising way of doing a honeymoon. Okay, just so you know.
So much fun.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah. Anyway, I want to have the three fish that we kept chasing a bait ball. Okay, and I was thinking, I reckon in my brain, how do I represent bait fish? Well, there's a streamer pattern that was originally designed to imitate the smelt, the rainbow smelt, called the Winnie Penny, which was designed and named for the lake where we went fishing. Okay, and to have a really nice fishhook upon which to tie a slightly fancied up version of this fly, I designed this fishhook. Okay, so I have the tail detail here leaning into the idea that this is representing minnows in a bait ball. I'm going to make 6 or 7 of these. I haven't quite exactly decided yet. This was the prototype, and this is the one that I actually do in the tutorial that you're about to watch, because this is the finished product. So, we will get started. I will start with the drawing phase, and we will go through all of the steps of carving a fancy ornamental bone fishhook. Please join. This is going to be a one-piece bone fish hook, but we're not going to do it out of a natural form. So just for reference, this is the little natural form fish hook that we did in the first video. And the second video was a two-piecer, and that's already been sent off to Mr. Rich Lamont. He's tied a fly on it, so go check out his channel if you're interested in the outcome of that. And now we're doing this little ornate fish hook. Now, this is not a hook that's designed to be a useful hook. This guy is, right? That is a hook that you would want to fish with. This is a decorative fish hook. And as I mentioned in the intro, this is going to have a very interesting specific purpose. So I'm designing the aesthetics of the hook for that specific purpose. Okay? So I sat down and I sketched out a couple of different variants, a forward variant, a curved down variant, and a curved up variant. And I like the middle one the best. Okay? This slightly curved circle hook kind of aesthetic to it. So from there, I just made a little bit of a tracing. Okay? That gets transferred onto a piece of bone, and then that gets carved out, and this is my prototype. Okay. Now, if you notice that this is a little bit shorter than my pattern, if you've seen any of my bone carving hooks before, I'll tell you over and over and over again not to put them in a vise or you'll break them. Well, I put it in a vise and I broke it. So it's a little shorter than originally intended. But it's still a very nice piece, and it's one of the half dozen or so that I'm going to make for this project. Okay? So the first step is simply transferring this pattern onto a suitable piece of bone. Now, this hook came from one side of this cutout of femur, and there's, from right there, okay, and there's plenty of room here for, being clumsy, for another one to live right in there, okay? Other bones that you could use, the other bone that has a nice big flat piece is the cannon bone here. Okay, you've got that nice flat surface. Right? This bone was cleaned by cutting it in half, removing all of the marrow, scraping it by hand. This one was cleaned by burying. I do recommend that you cut these and you remove the marrow, because this one I've had here in a very dry, heated house for a couple weeks since I dug it up, for a couple months, and you can see it's starting to get a couple of cracks in it. So there'll still be plenty of usable material in this bone, but if I had cut it and removed the marrow, it would not be cracking like that, right? Like this one, totally fine. And this won't crack because it's been hollowed out, it's been exposed, it can dry evenly, okay? Whereas this one is going to dry on the outside faster than the inside, and that's where you get the cracking from, the same as checks and wood. So what we need to do here is simply take our pattern and decide how this wants to be oriented. Okay. It might actually, it'll be a little bit better if I do it that way. Okay. And then I'm just going to come and I'm going to make a light tracing. This doesn't have to be perfect. I just need to know how much bone to cut out of this bone. Okay. We'll put this back on and we'll retrace it a couple times as we're going through here. But I just want a rough position of where the bone is going to fall in this piece. Is that showing up in the frame plan? Mm-hmm. Okay. 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 So that I know where to cut it out. Okay. And you can see this is very approximate. That's not a finished line. That's not going to be the finished piece. But if I think of in a straight line right along here and cut right on that line, that will give me more than enough room to cut this fish hook out of that flat piece of bone. Okay? So I'm going to reposition things and let's go for that cut. Okay, now, after a stern warning about putting a bone in a vise, I have a bone in a vise. This is the one time you can get away with it. Okay? If you have this in lengthwise, this is the direction in which the bone was intended to bear weight. So if you're careful and only put it in this way, you can get away with it. If you take it and squish it horizontal, you'll crush it. If you have a perfectly flat face, you can get away with it. But if there's any irregularity, and there's always some irregularity, then you'll break pieces off. Okay? So I just have a very gentle squeeze. You can see this is not fully immobilized. I can wiggle that out if I want to. But it's good enough that this can serve as an extra, let me just center that a little bit better, that this can serve as an extra pair of hands. And I will support the side with my actual hands. Well, this just keeps it from jiggling, wiggling around on me. We'll start to cut carefully. Okay. We're trying to level up our little filming station here a little bit with this workbench. I just want to turn this around and see what we got going there. Cut is crooked a little bit. Steer it straight some. We'll get lots of bone dust on the rug. That's always a pro. Okay. Now we are mostly through. Except you can see right here, we're cutting it kind of a wonky direction. Here, let me get that so it catches the light. There we go. We'll get that. We're easily all the way through. So what I'm going to do is just put this in the vise. Just kind of at an angle here, clipping that corner. Into that. Nah. That's not going to work well. Okay, I'll just hold it as though this was a carving cradle. And I'll just go down through that spongy stuff. And I betcha, yep, we can pop that off. So, there we go. We have a piece, and you can see even just from handling it there, we have rubbed most of that mark off. But that's okay. It served its purpose. We're going to draw and redraw and redraw that line many times as we go through this process. This is still a perfectly good piece of bone that will have other projects in it. Okay, nice thick bone. I am going to turn the camera off, get this retraced, and we'll talk about cutting out the out. Okay, here you go. I have traced the hook on and kind of darkened it in a bit with pencil. It's still not the neatest line, but it's plenty good enough for cutting out this piece. And on the back, I took a rasp, this big old Shinto wrap, which actually works remarkably well on bone as well as wood, and knocked the sharp edges off so that I don't lacerate myself in this process. Bone is sharp, right? Your teeth can cut meat. Your teeth are bone. This is bone. It can cut meat if it's sharp. You are meat. Don't get cut. Now, the first thing I want to do with the big saw is to come in, and anywhere that I can cut off a hunk, I'm going to do that. It's like here at the end, I can just whack off a nub. Okay? Just like that. And here I can go to the tip of the fin. Okay? Because this hacksaw is the fastest, sharpest, bestest way to knock off big chunks. And all the scraps will just go in there for the garden. Excuse me, getting the hiccups. Okay. Here, where you can take off a chunk. Let's get it positioned. I like riding the blade against that corner piece. That could be disastrous. It's just another point of stability. And then I'll kind of get this moved in till it is about where I want it. Okay. There's another piece. That is for the scrap bin. That's mostly spongy anyway. Okay. And we're zeroing in on it. Now, the thing we need to talk about next is cutting out these more awkward locations. To a certain extent, you can put this vertically here in the block, but you see when I try to get a blade started, it's just chattering. Okay, so cutting out these curved pieces requires another approach. So when we have a situation, like I'm working on the little triangle of bone that I need to remove from the tail here, where there's just absolutely no possible way that you can get this in a carving cradle and do any useful sawing with it, we need another solution. And that solution is to use one of these frame saws. This one is for woodworking, a regular fret saw. This is a jeweler's saw. Okay? And how we use these is, if you notice my little carving block here has a corner cut out of it. Okay? So we're going to take our piece of work, we're going to put it over that cutout, then we're going to position the blade in the frame saw so that the teeth point backwards. This way it cuts on the pull stroke rather than the push. Okay? So I could position this over this cutout, place the saw in here, and by pulling down, have it very well supported, and make pretty efficient work out of that. Okay? Now my cuts just don't quite meet. There we go. Okay? Now, I definitely pulled to the woodwright shop and cut most of that before I turned on the camera so that this wouldn't get too awful boring. But still, this makes very efficient progress, and you absolutely can use this sort of common, readily available, frequently available at yard sales woodworking saw. There's always things you're going to need to adjust or work around. So, you know, even if I start from the same basic plan 10 times in a row, I'll never have 10 identical pieces. And right here we kind of have an example of why. So this cut is an old pre-existing cut from before I started to lay out this piece. Okay? And you can see it takes quite a bit of material out and encroaches on the hook shank. Now, that's fine, but it does require a little bit of adjustment. So what I'm going to do here is stop cutting out the middle, and I'm going to take my most aggressive grasp and just work down on this. You better put it this way. Okay. I'm going to work down on this until I bring this line into the middle. Okay? Because this is going to be a curved surface, so I'll be taking that corner off anyway. I don't need material there, but I need to adjust the shape of the shank so that I have enough material to curve it off evenly when the thing's all done. So by taking a little bit of time to do this now, grab a different file here. A little bit of this work. Get into that corner a little bit better. Okay. And do it like that shape. Take a little off here. The Shinto rasp, by the way, is the same sort of saw blade that's used for making hacksaw. It does a nice job on the bone. Okay. So you can see I've just taken a bit off, and I'm seeing how much I'm going to need to take off. And now I'm just going to redraw this line so that it reflects the change in the hook shank there. Okay. And I'll leave a little bit of extra meat and start cutting on this line. Okay, so this saw works quite nicely for a lot of this. But when we start getting into the back here, that blade is just too wide to turn that tight of a corner. Okay? So this is where the jeweler saw comes in. Now, I prefer to do as much work with the woodworking version as possible because these little hair-fine blades, I just snap these like it's going out of style. Right? These blades are very fragile and very, very easy to break. And I know that because I have broken many of them. So how the jeweler saw operates, make sure I get this pointed in the right direction. It has these little clamps. You clamp the blade into one. These are also very, very fiddly. Okay. And then this adjusts so we can move this closer. Clamp the blade in the other side. And then pull out on this whole apparatus and tighten this to fix it in position. Okay. So, this is really wonderful because I can just very easily, it's also a thinner blade than that, so it just comes in and out very, very simply. And now I can do the same operation with this and come around that hard turn in the back of this hook. Okay. Now I'm a little shy of it there, so I'll have a bit of extra work to do with the file. But that's okay. And you see, I already broke it once. Okay, but I got where I needed to go. I go through these blades so fast that that's why I prefer to do the majority of the work with the other saw. But now that I got around that turn, there's a little piece of it, okay, I will need to put another one in and finish around there, okay. As long as I can get at least to here with that little blade, I can finish up the rest of that with the other saw. So I'm going to keep going, cutting this out, and we'll join back in a few moments. So we have this piece cut out, and this is just a very rough blank. I kind of think of this as the ugly duckling stage of making one of these, right? If we compare it to the pattern, because I changed the shape of the hook and then gave myself a little bit of extra space, gave myself a little bit too much extra space down in this region, okay? I'm going to make the hook point a little bit straighter than the original pattern, but I have more than enough material to cut out everything that I want to cut out. But it is just a very rough cutout, right? This one was just as ugly at the same stage, so never fear, this will turn into a nice item. But it has to go through the ugly duckling stage. Now, if I didn't have, I'm obviously using steel tools for everything here. If I didn't have steel tools, could I make a hook like this? And the answer is, of course, yes, right? What would I do? Well, I would basically use nothing but files, and if I didn't have a steel file, you could use chips of sandstone of various grits, right? Sandstone or like a volcanic pumice, just any rough natural rock. You would go down to a stream, you would take your bone, you would go down to a stream, you would use a coarse one with a sharp edge to saw through it until you could fracture it, and then you would just file out all of these negative spaces, right? Why am I not doing that? Well, first off, cutting out something like this, I think that's the one, yes, the one that came from there, right? Cutting out something like this is vastly faster than trying to file out all of that material and turning it into bone dust. Second is, if you look at all of the offcuts, and this is from both hooks, so I'll put this other one back up here too. If you look at all of the large offcuts, and this isn't even counting just the little pieces, right? All of this is useful material for some other project. I don't know what project I will put it to, but I am certainly not throwing this out, right? Like that could be a really nice needle or a pin. These could have fish hooks in their own right, or they could be tips to wooden fish hooks, or some other who knows what, right? There's a lot of utility in these pieces still, okay? So this is not junk. But if I was doing this the real old school way, and filing out all of the negative space, all of this would be dust like that, and I wouldn't have these extra pieces. So this is much more conservative in terms of use of material and having nice scraps from one project with which to make smaller projects, okay? So now, how do we get out of the ugly duckling phase and to start to organize more of our finished shape? And the answer is we just need to start and look at, we need to pick a piece of the composition and really fine tune it and dial it in, and so that we can use it as a reference for the rest. Now, the primary reference for this is going to be the main shank of the hook, okay? So as I'm looking at this, I'm just looking at the lines, and here, this line is pretty good, except I want to soften that hump a little bit, but this inside is kind of a mess. So I'm going to work on finishing this round to a final shape, just with the super coarse file, and then starting to come in with the half round and evening out this bottom until I have nice matching pleasing contours on both the top and the bottom line. So that's going to take me a bit of work and quite a while. So I'm going to turn the camera off here and we'll rejoin in just a few seconds for you. Nice even line here along this top. I did cut out another little piece, and you can see there, you know, how much I cut relative to how much I filed out there in the back. And now, since we have one long line the way we want it, we can come in and we can use this reference point to establish the rest of the lines. So I want to take this tip and I want to swoop down, and I want this section of hook to be just ever so slightly more narrow than the top. So there's a little bit of difference in form. Okay. So with this reference point in place, we can come down and we can make some good decisions about here. And then once I have this section in place, then we can establish what we want to do with the transition to the tail and how much barb. And hint, a lot of that's getting cut off. That's outlandishly big, right? But I very much recommend when you're going through a carving, you go through from one thing to the next, from the most important reference points, which are usually going to be your longest lines, especially if you have straight lines that have to establish everything else, to the next reference point, from that reference point to the next reference point, from that reference point to the next reference points. Okay? And get each one the way you want it before you move on. If you just take your file or your sandpaper, your rasp, or your carving knife, whatever medium you're working with and toolkit you have, and just randomly go hitting things here, there, and everywhere, you're going to end up with a finished piece that's here, there, and everywhere, right? So establish an orderly progression from one reference point to the next. So this is just going to be more file work, carving out the transition to the hook point. Okay, so just so you can kind of see the difference a little easier, there's that same little piece that I cut out, and this is now filed to the final inside shape. And you can see along this surface, it's pretty much all the same width, and then here it tapers to about 2/3 of the starting width. Okay? So there's just a little bit of, flow and direction. Since it tapers out to the point here, I wanted to kind of start that taper a little bit before we get to the barb. Okay, just an aesthetic thing. If this was a practical fish hook, I wouldn't care about that, right? But this is a hang-on-the-wall art piece, so I do, right? Okay, the next thing I want to establish is the base of the fin. Right, so on this one, I cut that at a little bit jauntier of an angle than I initially wanted to. And that's okay, because we have excess mass in this one, so I can trim this down to be symmetrical with that one. But before I worry about the fin tips, that'll be the absolute last thing that I do, because I'm still kind of propping this up and filing on it, and I want to leave good stability in those so I don't snap things off. I do want to get this transition to the fin established now, though. So if we kind of look at draw a little guideline in here, okay, where that transition will be, I want to come down to about there from this fin, and then have that taper out nicely into the fish hook, okay? So, if you look at the bend of the hook, this curve needs to translate into the overall geometry of the other things going on. Okay? And that's that nice little skinnier at the bottom, fatter at the top little curve. Okay? So again, I'm not going to do any more saw work. I'm just going to use my ever-present files to trim that material down, and then we'll come back and look at the barb. That transition roughed in pretty nicely. Now I want to look at this. And what I want to do is, if you were to think about this coming in without a barb, right along that sort of curve. Okay. I want to mirror that curve in the barb, but expand it out a little bit. Right? So if I give myself that much barb width, right, which is pretty similar to what we got in that one, okay, then I want to bring that in gently so it matches at the tip to where the natural curve of a hook point would be. Okay? So, I'm going to use the hacksaw and probably cut about that much off with the hacksaw because I can easily do that without getting in the way of the fin. And then again, file it to shape. So here we go. We have a barb system that is much more in keeping with the overall lines of the hook. Okay, but when you're doing your first course rough out, you want to make sure that you leave extra material in there. That's why all carvings go through an ugly duckling phase, right? You're supposed to go through the ugly duckling phase. It's supposed to look super chonky because you need that material there to go through this process. One reference point at a time, bringing it back into the final shape. When you're just roughing out your block, there's just too much going on. You can't do all of that all at once accurately. Now, just for perspective, here's the little chip that I cut off of there. And there's some additional filing, right? So that's about where we started and where we ended up. Okay, I think you'll agree it's a lot sleeker now. Okay. And the next thing that we want to do is work toward overall flatness. We have the shape in place. I need to refine the tie-off nub. I need to refine the tail. But again, those are small projections. They're going to happen absolute dead last. The tail is just going to stay in the ugly duckling phase for a little while longer, okay? Because I want that stability and rigidity as I do the rest of the carving. But I need to start getting this thing kind of globally flat. If you look at what's going on with it, if I put it up on this face, it's dished, right, in this direction. This is high, that's low, okay? Now, across here, from tail to nose, this is relatively flat until you get to about here, where my finger is. Then it kind of flares out. And if you look at this side, from tail to nose, about here it flails out a lot. So let me just hold this up. I want to bring this to an even thickness. Just like I brought it to an even width along its length, I want to bring it to an even thickness across the middle. Okay? But I'm going to favor this side and take more material out of this side. And I kind of rough sketch that here a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit off here, but about twice that much off of this side. And then again, I need to start tapering this hook into a point, the tip into a point. But this is the high spot, so I'm going to leave most of this and take more material from this side. Okay? And the fins, I'm just leaving the heck alone for a little while longer. So, you guessed it, more filing. Okay, so we have this pretty well completely roughed out. The basic shape is all here. The main beam and the nose, this is all to a nice final thickness. And that's approximately as wide as it is deep there. Okay, so that'll round off quite nicely. One thing I want to note after doing this is, you see this facet right there? That and this little facet there is all that remains of that big steep cut that was in there from the initial cutout. Remember I pointed that out and filed off the top here, just straightened the hook a little bit to accommodate that. Okay? So that's just kind of a little bit of a teachable moment here, because when you have little blemishes or little irregularities in a carving, don't worry too much about it. You can almost always just make a small adaptation to what you're doing and it will come out just fine. Okay? And subject of thumbs up, if you wanted to go and give this video a thumb up, it would help the algorithm know that you are enjoying it, and I would be very, very grateful for that. So thank you. Now, this is going to go completely away, and that's just going to help us in the rounding off process when we get to there. What I want to do next is shape the front of the hook. So this is where the snood lashing is traditionally put, and we need to bring this in and taper this a bit so that we have a better seat for said lashing. Okay. And I basically just want to cut out a belly of material so that it ends up looking thusly, give or take a little bit. Okay. And the way I like to do this is to start with a small file because it's easy to control. Okay. Just going to prop this on here. I'm just kind of holding that shank in my hand, putting my thumb against the block, and then the down pressure of the file is just going to hold that there. Because I'm not going to be using a whole heck of a lot of pressure. But these little files are extremely controllable. Okay. So there, just a little tick to start. And what that will do is it will help my coarse file. Is that the coarse one? Yeah, that's the coarse one. Register with that. So now when I come in with the coarse file, I don't have to worry about it glancing all over the place. And I can just focus on the work I want to do. See, we're very short period of time. We just made a whole lot of progress there. Okay. Just looking at it, just to look at the shape. Okay, good stuff. I'm liking how it's coming out. Okay, but I want to take more off there, so I need a file that's a little bit wider. And where did that one go? Oh, here it is. Okay, and that is pretty much that. I like that. I like how that is just right there. That's a nice even curve. Just kind of holding it up. It's often good to hold this at arm's length against a solid surface. It's after dark at the moment, so I'm just looking at the contrast between the white bone and the dark outside window. And I want to take a little bit more off there. Okay. Yeah, I like that. There's still a little bit of a facet right there, but that'll come off in the rounding process. Okay. So that's how I like to cut those. We'll do some similar things down here a little bit, but the next thing I want to do is this has to taper to a point. Okay. So I'm going to take, my super coarse saw rasp here and just start tapering away. Okay? And then on the other side, tapering away. Okay? Then we'll do the same on the point. And taper that away. Okay? And then also, of course, on the other side. Now, I need to, each of these strokes, I've got to get it situated somewhere that I have something to press against, that I can press down, that I have an angle of attack. And that's going to be hard for me to do in a way that you can see it on the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to taper this section and that point off camera, and then I'll talk about how I like to form the barb and pretty well centered. Okay. When you're doing these, there's always going to be an easy way to hold it where you can get good purchase on your carving cradle, and then you'll flip it over and it'll be a pain in the butt. And if it's easy on one side, beware, you're going to pay for it when you flip it over on the other side, because usually it seems the easier it is on one side, the bigger a pain in the butt it is on the other, right? Just expect that it's okay, just go slow and be careful. Because the last thing you want to do is be working on this file, slip, and take a big chunk out of the side of it at this point. Okay? The closer you get done, the closer you get to finished, the harder it is to recover mistakes. Okay? When you're just cutting out the blank and it's still in the ugly duckling phase, you can recover almost any mistake. You just change shape a little bit because you have plenty of material to work with. At this stage, I haven't started to round it yet. So if I make a mistake, it's probably just going to take a chunk out of a corner where it's going to get removed anyway. And if you wait until after it's rounded and almost done to make a mistake, well, now you just have a gouge in your finished piece, right? So try to, the closer you get to finished, it's human nature to get excited and just want to be done and see your finished thing. Slow down, be careful, and do it right. Also notice, in everything that I've done up to this point, I'm always working in square-ish section, right? And I'm going to say square-ish because obviously I'm starting to taper some things here. But I didn't start to taper until I had all of the rough squares shaped out, right? So you rough out the outline completely square, and then you start to taper mostly square, and then you start to round. And that's where we're doing now. So the square, octagon, round rule applies. I'm going to start rounding things by taking small files, and again, the closer I get to done, the more I'm going to use small files. Okay, and just taking off the corners. Okay, and I'll work on one face and then switch and work at the other. Okay. Now, could you use a Dremel for this? Of course you could. This is a good spot right here that I can go to a larger file because there's nothing to hit. Could you use power tools, power sanders, and Dremels for this? Of course you can. But I want to show you all of this with hand tools so you can see that you can do it in hand tools. Because I don't want people watching this to feel like there's a high barrier to entry. And if you don't have that Dremel, that you can't do fine work. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The minimum toolkit for bone carving is a bone and a rock. And from there up, every tool you add can give you sometimes a new capability, definitely save time. But you can absolutely do beautiful bone carving work with a bone and a rock. It's going to take a long time, but you can do it. Okay? So I'm just making octagonal facets. It's probably not going to pick up too well on the film, but I'm forming a line right here that I'm tracing with the back of this file, and I'm looking and I'm making sure that that line is straight, even, and true. Okay? If you get these octagonalizing, I don't know if that's a word or not, but it is now, facets, nice, straight, and true, at this stage, when you go to round it off, it will just fall into place, and you'll have very nice rounded surfaces. Okay? If you get these wonky now, then rounding it off is a bear. Okay? Now here, I don't want to cut into that corner, so I'm starting right at that corner and moving away from it with every stroke. Don't go this way, or you will gradually cut into that corner. Okay? This, not that. This. Okay? I touch it and then move away. I'm using my small file here. Because I want that control in that kind of dangerous spot. Okay. Smoothed a couple things off. Yes, I did move in that direction a little bit, but I wasn't going all the way to the corner. I was just working in that middle region. Okay, that all looks good to my eye. We'll work this corner now. I have enough space. I think I can move up a chisel. But still, I touch and then I move away. So I'm never bearing any weight against that corner. Checking my lines, make sure they're even. They're pretty nice. This is just a function of sighting along it in every direction that you can see. Okay. And then to do the final rounded form, you're just doing this and take the edges off. You will never get it 100% perfectly round with the file. There will always be some faceting because the file is a non-flexible flat surface. But you can get it darn close. And that last little bit to make it perfectly round, well, that's what sandpaper's for. Okay. And I'm not taking off gobs of material, so I'm not too scared if I touch that corner a little bit at this point. Lightly rounding, just trying to get control of the shape. And mostly just enough control of the shape that the next step will go well. Just keep switching it up, if I could word. Keep switching it up. Just whatever tool is most comfortable and working most efficiently in a certain spot, use that. Don't be afraid to switch tools. You've got them, use them. Okay? You don't need a ton. You definitely need that little small guy. You need a larger half round. I have a larger yet half round, and I have this size in a finer grade. And I have a couple of flat files, but I mostly just use the flats of these and ignore the other flat files. And I do like a nice, fine, thin file like that for some of the finish work, right? So 4 files and you're good for a minimum toolkit. And of course that rasp. Now, the next step is to work on that little catch. Okay, so I want the side of the hook to be a little bit proud of this tie-off point. And I want a little bit of architecture and carving on that junction, okay, so that yarns can seep into there. So I want to continue this taper. So you see if I take the edge of the file, that depicts a nice even taper. Okay, that is where I want to start cutting down. So I'm going to use the corner of the file and just start a groove. Okay. Again, notice what I'm doing. I'm cutting and then moving away from the spots that I don't want to diminish in size, right? Cut and move away toward the waist side. Cut, move away toward the waist side. Okay? Now that that's established, I can feel the larger file purchase into that groove, right? I don't even have to see it. I can just feel it click. Okay? And now I'm cutting in and then rolling over and off. Okay? Cut in and then roll over. Okay? Now as that gets deeper, now I just want to bring this down flat. So I'm just going to go very slowly and not touch that edge at all. Because that transition is deeper than the tip of this. I'll hold it up to a contrasting surface, and it's starting to lean over a little. That's what I want. Just a couple more passes. Okay. And that's good. Okay. So if you look at what I have here, here's the curve of the hook shank, and this comes up and then leans over just a little bit down, and then the other side is untouched. Okay, so this, as opposed to that, is that little triangle of material I just removed with the files. Okay. We'll now do the same on the other side. That was the easy to hold side. So this is going to be the pain in the neck side. There's always a pain in the neck side. That's not too bad. Starting, once I can purchase with the small file, I'll start leaning over and running off the edge. And then once I have enough, never put your files down on top of each other like that. It takes the teeth right off. I can switch to the larger file and make faster progress. And we're still early enough in this process. A couple of stray file scratches aren't going to ruin anything if you slip. Don't lose too much sleep over it. Now I'm just looking for symmetry. And it's symmetrical at the base, but this top is proud. So I just need to take a little bit more off there. Okay, good. Now that's a little bit taller than I need it to be. So I'm just going to shorten it a smidgen. All of this is just by eye. I don't have a certain pattern that I must make. I'm just working for proportionality. Trying to keep it nice looking. Okay. And now I'm going to go back to the small file, and we're going to square octagon round this little nubbin. Okay. Just like that. Now I'm not going to try and get it 100% perfect. I just want it shaped. There's going to be a lot of sanding work. And when you're working with a file like this, no matter how careful you are, you're going to cut a little deeper over here and a little shallower over there, and you're going to have some, in these transitions. These are very, very hard to get perfect with a file. So we'll get them darn close with a file, and then get them perfect with sandpaper. Okay. I've heard and read some commentaries on carving that will say things like, you should never consider sandpaper one of your carving tools. It's just your final finishing. And to that I say, baloney. Sandpaper is absolutely a carving tool, because it's the only carving tool in your arsenal that's completely flexible. So especially in round work, it's invaluable to be able to go and do those last couple hard to reach, hard to even out spots with your sandpaper. Just want to round that here. So here I did a lot of rounding, but now I want to change the shape. So since I'm changing the shape of this top, just so that it looks a little bit smoother, I'm going back to square work. And now that I have it where I was going for, I'll go back to rounding. Okay, so there we go. That's looking a little bit more like something. Okay, it's not quite exactly the same shape as this one. It's a little bit taller. It's a little bit taller than I was kind of going for. That one was a little bit shorter than I was fully going for, so we're okay. It's nice. It's in range, right? And we'll do a lot more with sandpaper. Okay, now I've rough rounded up to about here. Okay. I'm going to work on rounding this off to the base, rounding this, and then I'll show you how I do some detail work in this barb. So here we go. Spent quite a bit of time rounding all of this off, although the rounding stage goes relatively quickly if you set up all of your contours correctly prior to this stage, right? So if you start rounding too early and you don't have all of your shapes set up the way you want them, then it's going to be lumpy and bumpy and weird and squiggly and wiggly and goofed up, and you're just going to be chasing your tail forever, trying to get all those bumps and wiggles out, and it's not going to go well. If you take the time to do the square rough out properly, so all of your overall contours are where they need to be, then you're just knocking the edges off. And that's, it's bone, it's a hard material, so it's a lot slower to carve than, pine or basswood or something that's really soft and cuts like butter. But it's very direct and straightforward. Okay? Now, the last two details that we need to work on are the transition between the barb and the shank and the tail fins. And if you look at the finished one, the barb is ever so slightly narrower than the shank. There's a little bit of definition right in there. Okay? If you just look at it face on, it's not going to be real dramatic, but it's kind of one of those things where if you do it right, it won't really stand out, but if you do it wrong, it will be noticeable that it feels clunky. Okay? So we don't want a clunky fishhook, we want a graceful fishhook. So what I'm going to do is exactly the same thing as I did up at that tie-off lug, and that's, I'm going to picture how the curve of the hook would continue if there was no barb, right? And it would be about like that. Okay? So the hook tapers toward the tip, and that taper really gets strong right about there. So the corner of the hook that I want to thin out is that dark square. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm not going to have a sharp line here and a sharp line there. That would also look clunky and weird. Okay. So I'm going to come with the file right along that line. And again, I have this is a small half round. I have flat up and half round down because I don't want to carve 90-degree angles into anything. Any work you do, 90s are the devil. Okay. And I'm just going to slowly start cutting down in. Okay. So I've made a little trough. And now I'm going to come with the flat side, and I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick it up well, but I have the little trough right there, and it's proud here. So I want this to come up flat, and then I'll taper that facet in so it's a smooth curve around the rest of there. Okay. So to do that, I'll take the flat down, and just like I did up here, I'll start in contact with that little ridge I made, and then move away from it, not toward it. Okay. Once all that's established and I can register well, I can do the same with a larger file. Okay. And that's all that took. And you can see all that pencil mark is gone, but I haven't messed with most of the barb. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same on the other face. This is the direction that's a little easier to go at. Remember, if the first direction you try is difficult, don't worry, the next direction will be a little easier. And if the direction you're going feels easy, don't worry, you'll pay for it soon. It's always how it seems to be with these sort of little carvings. Okay? Yeah. And now, that's not a huge, if I point this right at the camera, this width is not vastly thinner than that width. But it is a little bit. And it's one of those things that, you know, like I said, if you do it right, it's not going to stand out and be immediately noticed. If you do it wrong, it'll feel clunky. Okay? So if you're making carvings and stuff keeps feeling clunky, it's very likely some of those little things, you know, such as that, where the layering within your piece just isn't quite what you would naturally expect. And the eye is really good. I'm just going to keep rounding this now. The eye, the human eye, is very good at recognizing situations that just don't feel like they're supposed to. You know? You won't necessarily know why it doesn't feel like it's supposed to, but you'll know that it doesn't feel quite like it's supposed to. Kind of round this over a little bit. And this is another basic rule of carving. Never leave anything square. I defy you to find a truly flat surface anywhere on your body. Maybe you could find a very small flat facet somewhere on one of your teeth. But if you look carefully enough, it's probably not as flat as you first thought. Okay. So this is going to be the hard side. So don't leave anything flat in your carvings. Unless it's very deliberate, and the point that you're trying to make is that the flat surface is not natural. The exception to that would be if you have a case where the idea that you want to communicate is that something isn't natural. Right? So just sitting here trying to think up a hypothetical. So let's say you wanted to carve a treehouse. You wanted the whole tree to look natural, but the door to look contrived. In that instance, it would be fair to have a perfectly flat door because it will stand out as something which doesn't really belong. And that could be effective. But shy of that, you're not allowed to have anything flat. Okay. So we're very close. I just have, it's probably not going to pick up. But you can see there's a couple little irregularities right in this area. Is that picking up, beloved?
No.
Right in there? Okay.
Not really.
They're very, very small. But this is where, I can see a little corner here that's kind of developed. So I'll just very carefully file that off. And if you're carving something and it ends up looking clunky or unnatural, and you can't figure out why, your eye's telling you something just isn't as it should be, but you can't find the problem. One of the first things to look for is flat surfaces. See if you left a flat surface somewhere. If you did, find it and fix it. And in all likelihood, your carving will feel a lot less clunky when you're done. Okay, so that is roughed in. You see, ooh, that's a really nice shadow showing that, just that little divot right there. Okay? So that, again, if I didn't have that, this barb to hook shank transition, that would be a flat spot. Right? So I'm just lowering this little bit of the barb to force this out of flat. Okay? Now, that's done. This whole thing is roughed out. We need to look at the tail fin. So let me bring the prototype over, see where we're going with this. Okay. And these are going to come out slightly differently. That's okay. They are, in actuality, both pretty much the same size. This one may end up a tiny bit smaller. Now, if you look at this, we do want symmetry in this tail fin. Okay? So this tail is still in the ugly duckling phase. I have done no work other than just flatten it a little bit on the faces. Okay? So this fin is coming off at a slightly jauntier angle than that fin. This fin has less meat in it than that fin. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to round off and shape and curve this upper fin because it's the smaller, less meaty fin. And then I will have enough meat in this fin that I can carve away a little bit of material to make it match the first one. Okay? So again, it's especially when you're learning to carve, and I'm just going to go to town, just kind of rounding things. You get your idea, you make your pattern, and then you cut out your first piece. And you always want to leave the line, right? You want to leave a little extra material. But then you cut out your piece, you look at what you have left, you look at what you've got, and you think, oh my gosh, golly, gee whizzikers, what have I done? That looks like trash. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. That's a stage that all carvings are going to go through. If you are good enough and confident enough with your saw and your cutout procedure, that you don't need to leave as much extra material for working on, okay, fine. But that's not what I would recommend to any beginner that you try to do. Leave the extra material, except the ugly duckling stage. And don't be worried about the ugly duckling stage. It's okay. Totally fine. It's supposed to be that way. Okay. So don't give up on it. And I would recommend that you do it that way, leaving extra material and accepting that there's going to be an ugly duckling stage. Because you might screw up. You might slip with your file while you're working here and put a ding over here. And if you have extra material, so what? It doesn't matter. It's going to come off when you round it out. Okay? Give yourself that material. So, I like that fin profile. That's good. It's a little bit counterfactual for a smelt. They come to a true point, but with everything here being so organic and curvy, I don't really want to pull that out to a true sharp point, right? I'm going to finish it to a more rounded profile like this one. It's okay. It's a fly representing a minnow, so it's already just inherently counterfactual. I'm fine with that. Okay? Now, let's compare this lower fin to the upper. I'm going to draw some marks. If you don't need to draw these marks, you can just kind of visualize this and work on it, that's fine. But again, while you're learning and starting to develop these skills, draw the marks. Okay? So this is slightly longer than that. So I'm going to take a little bit off of the whole tip. Okay? And then to round it off, I'm going to take a little bit off there. Okay? And then that will make a fairly nice V shape on the interior, so I'm not going to really touch the base. But to bring the thickness down, I'm going to take a little bit off there. Okay? So what I'm marking in the pencil is material to be removed, and that will yield an approximately symmetrical fin. And you know what? Approximately symmetrical is perfectly fine. Right? We're imitating a minnow. Minnows are not perfectly symmetrical either. No real living organism is perfectly symmetrical. So don't expect your carving to be perfectly symmetrical. If it is perfectly symmetrical, it's going to look like a computer did it. And if you want things that look like a computer did it, why are you watching this channel? Okay. So you can see, just with removing that little excess, they're starting to come more into true with each other. Okay. Now we're going to do a little bit of work on the tip. Okay. It's a little bit out of square. Trying to correct that. And see how I keep moving it until I find a comfortable spot to support it here on the carving cradle. Okay. What do you think, folks in the chat? Coming along? Okay. You can't see what I'm doing, but I'm just holding the white, it's nighttime, I'm just holding the white tail up against at arm's length here, just like this, up against the dark background of the window. That's a good way to just let your eye see irregularities. I'm going to take just a little bit more off of the tip here. That's another thing you should do regularly. Hold your work up at arm's length and see how it's going. It's very easy to get hyper-focused on some particular little spot and lose track of the overall picture. And then you'll end up with a divot where you don't want a divot. Okay. So there we go. Again, notice it's still perfectly square. I don't start rounding until all of the shapes are exactly where I want them, which is down. So, more filing, round her off. Okay. Take off the corners, take off the other corner, and then just turn it and round it off. I'm going to finish the tail off camera, and then we'll talk about the final finishing and sanding. So in terms of actual shaping, this hook is done. Okay. So the tail is finished, barb, tie off, everything's rounded off. This really is its final shape. The next step is the final sanding and the final cleanup. So if we look, I have 3 pieces of sandpaper here, and these are the 3 grits that I use. I use 80, very, very little. Also notice I have good sandpaper, right? These 2 are emery cloth made for metalwork, and this is garnet paper, also used for metalwork, okay? Cheap, chintzy, junk sandpaper isn't worth free, let alone whatever it costs. Go spend an extra couple cents or $1 a sheet and get actual good sandpaper, or you're going to hate sanding, okay? Now, these 2 I use the most. This I just kind of smooth it out. I don't use 80 a whole lot. Where I will use it are places like this transition of the tail to the body. I want a little bit of a cupped shape there. Again, avoid flats. So when I was filing, I filed down a little bit and then kind of worked it up from both sides just so it wasn't quite perfectly flat. Then the same on this side. Okay. And I want to accentuate that a little bit with the sandpaper. Now, the nice thing about sandpaper is you can fold it into any shape that you want. So I can come and I can really get in there and do some actual shaping with the 80 grit sandpaper. Okay. Also notice I'm not making a dust cloud. since I'm hand sanding, all of the dust is just sitting right here. I don't have a big dust cloud in my face. Okay. Still, if you have any kind of breathing problems, or want to make sure that you don't develop breathing problems, wearing a mask is always good because bone dust is bad for you. Again, right here in the fork of the tail, that was a little tricky to get into with the file. So I'll come and I'll do a little bit of 80 grit sandpaper work in there. Could you carve an entire thing with 80 grit sandpaper and no files? Yes, you absolutely could. That's basically the same concept as using rock files as abrasives, which is the pre-metallurgical way to do this.
It would just take forever.
It would take a minute. Okay, so where I want to do some actual coarse shaping yet with a moldable abrasive, I'll again use the 80 grit. Now, let's look at the shank. This, I don't need to do any additional actual material removal, but I want to get rid of all of the facets from the file. And here, the moldability and softness of sandpaper, again, comes in handy. Because as I press on it, it's going to press into my finger, okay? And so my finger plus the thick sandpaper is just going to make a nice concavity, which will mirror the convex surface that this shank wants to have, okay? So this is the good thing to do with the 150 grit is to remove all of the file marks and all of the deep scratches left by the 80 grit, and all of those facets from filing. And this can take some time. I'll spend more time with this 150 grit than the 80 or the finishing sandpapers. Okay? And then the facets that's that little section I was just working on there. Facets are gone already. Okay? So it's not a huge amount of time. But do take the time to do it. Because removing those facets, deep file marks or deep gouges from the 80 grit with 220 is a pain in the neck. Okay? So the 220, all you want to be doing, you don't want to be doing any shaping when you're down to the 220. You just want to be removing the 150 scratches. Okay? And 220 on bone kind of leaves a scratch pattern that's not really visible as scratches unless you look really, really close. You can see a scratch pattern if you look really, really close. It mostly just kind of leaves it smudgy looking. Okay? Now, if this was a fish hook for fishing, I wouldn't worry about going past 220. Since these are decorative, I want some friction on the shank where I'm going to be tying the fly. But everywhere else other than right on the shank, I will take a 350 or 400 grit and just kind of remove the smudginess of the 220 grit. Okay? But I personally don't like shiny bone. A very low gloss, just below waxy, is all I want to get to. I don't want visible scratches. I don't want something that you would look and say, oh, that's a smudge from the sandpaper. I don't want that to be obvious. But I just want its natural dull to slightly waxy finish. Okay? Super shiny, high polished bone. I mean, you could sand this up to 1200 grit and literally make it shiny. But won't keep that shine. And it's going to get smudgy again. Okay? And if you do that, any scratch that you incur in its use life is going to show up against that glossy background. Okay? So if you want, shiny things, use gemstones that are hard and won't scratch in their normal use. If you want to work with bone, leave it a little bit dull and don't try to make it super shiny. At least that is my personal humble opinion. I have a finished piece. I have sanded the majority of this to 220 grit, And now the next thing that we need to do is to ignore it for a couple days and then come back and reinspect and see if there's any little things you want to fix up, right? So while I'm sitting here studying, working on it, there's something in this that is an undesirable blemish that I'm just not seeing because I've basically memorized how I want it to look. You walk away for a couple of days and you come back and you will have lost that kind of memorization of what you thought you wanted it to be. You'll see what it actually is, and then you'll go and you'll fix that little spot, right? And that's something you want to do before you take it to your final polish. Again, my final polish is probably going to be, something in the order of 325 or 350. Just a nice, light, gentle polish there. The last reason, I mentioned a couple reasons I don't like shiny bone. The other is I think it just looks like plastic, And once again, this is Old Ways Rising Farm, not Plastic Ways Rising Farm. Don't be plastic, right? You're here for this stuff, not for plastic. Don't be plastic. I guess that could be taken multiple ways depending on context. But anyway, so there we have our first two of quite a few bone hooks. Which one do I like the best? I don't know. I think I actually like this one best at this point. But I like that they're different. I like that there's a diversity. I think that the tail to body ratio is a little bit better for this one. Although smelt have such tiny tails, this one's a little bit more accurate, right? This one's a little bit more counterfactual, but I kind of like that, So I don't know. They'll all be different. The next one is going to come out of the third piece of bone from this little cutoff. And you can see this has got all sorts of wonky curves, and I'm just going to allow those to be part of the piece. I will take my pattern, I'll just kind of work it in as I can, and sketch an outline to cut out my initial ugly duckling, okay? And just work it in. It'll probably be short. I don't think I'll be able to use this last little bit, so it'll be a shorter one like this. Okay, probably, maybe even a little bit shorter than that. We'll just see, And I'll keep going until I have, 6 or 7 of these guys, and then be ready to jump into the next project. So, I hope that you have learned something. I hope that this has been a little bit useful and inspiring and helped with some of your carving skills and ideas. And this isn't just about bone carving. All of these heuristics to designing, roughing, composing, finishing a project apply to any carving project you would endeavor to take on. The biggest difference is just how homogeneous your material is. Bone is pretty homogeneous. Bone is pretty homogeneous. Wood is pretty non-homogeneous, so there are some differences there. If you could do the same process with metal or soap, right? And you'll have some differences in tool selection, some differences in homogeneity and how you approach the material, but the overall heuristics are pretty universal. So, if you've enjoyed this, I'd be ecstatically happy and most grateful if you subscribe so that you could continue to see how these things evolve, and I'll see you next time here at Old Ways Rising Farm.